Greetings. This is another one of our sessions chatting with someone in Canada who's active in inclusive education. I'm Gordon Porter, and I'm the Director of Inclusive Education Canada. My colleagues today are Diane Richler, who's a former Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada, used to be called the Canadian Association for Community Living. And Diane is now active with projects related to inclusive education on a global level, most specifically with Inclusion International. And Jackie Specht, who's the chair of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education, and she's a professor at Western University in London, Ontario. So we're happy today to welcome to our little chat Monique Somma, who's an assistant professor at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. And Monique has been a teacher, a special education teacher. She's been active as a researcher most recently. I noticed, Monique, that you've done work on the bullying experiences of youth with emotional and behavioral disorders. And I know you've worked on early childhood issues. Right now, you're involved in a project with Montessori schools, working with Inclusive Education Canada. So you've got a lot of different experiences that we can chat with you about today. Welcome. And let's start by you just telling a little about how you happen to be someone working in this area of inclusive education.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. And thanks, Diane and Jackie, for having me. So I actually started my career as a teacher, not as my first choice. Interestingly enough, I'll quickly just explain that because I think it puts things in perspective a little bit when you get to know me. I had did my undergrad degree in child and youth studies, and I had always in my mind and in my heart wanted to work with individuals with special needs or exceptionalities. And I think that was largely due to my background experience as a student myself in interactions I had had throughout elementary and secondary school with individuals in different programs that were available for students. So it was just, I just felt like it was always in my heart. And so I thought that special education teachers, because a lot of my colleagues, of course, classmates in child and youth studies were going into teaching. And I thought that special education teachers got to be special education teachers because they had lots of teaching experience. And I didn't know if I wanted to put in the years of teaching to be able to get to be a special education teacher. So of course, this is young. I'm young and naive at this point in my life. I was maybe 20, 22 maybe. And I had thought that maybe my pathway would be looking into assessment. So I had applied to this program that we have in Ontario at University of Toronto, which is pretty highly rated, and I didn't get in. And I was really disappointed, but I thought, okay, what can I do better? And my grades weren't high enough. And so I went back and started taking some more more psychology courses. They wanted me to have more psychology background. So I started doing a second degree in psychology, and I was working. And I applied to the school board and I started working as a child and youth worker. And when I was in that role, I was doing a lot of classroom intervention programs, and I did some one-on-one stuff, but it was mostly classroom intervention stuff. And I had some teachers, I was at two different schools, and I had teachers say to me, "Why are you not going into teaching?" And I said, "Well, because this is really what I want to do." And through those conversations, because I was at one school that actually at the time had two self-contained classes, and this is going back quite a few years, and she said, "You're just so good in front of the class. You really need to consider this as a possibility." And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just try, and if it could be my backup plan if I don't get into this assessment program again, which, as you can know, I did not, that could be my backup plan. And it worked out, and I was able to apply. And because I was in the school, I was able to get my application. I had 1 week to get my application together for Teachers College. And luckily for me, that was the year. Now this is going to age me. that the application process went electronic. So if I had applied prior to that, I would have had to send everything in by mail. But this year it had gone electronic and I was able to get all of my things in quite quickly. And so that's how my path started. And when I graduated from Teachers College, I did get a job right away working for a school board in a self-contained class. And I thought that's what I wanted to do, because I thought that was really what my calling was. And that's where, my path was to lead me. And I was there for a few years and then moved on to a different board and in a different self-contained class. And when I was in that second placement, I started to realize that there had to be something more for these students. And I did a lot of work with, I had a really supportive staff, and the teachers were very, very open. And we did a lot of both integration, but also reverse integration, I guess, I think it might have been called, where we had students coming in and doing kind of peer support kind of programs with the students in our class. And we actually had one little guy that was pretty much included most of the day in his grade 3 class. And so that was really, really cool. But again, it required, because it wasn't something that was mandatory at that time. So it required the staff at the school to be open to that. And that's where I really started to see how much more they could learn and grow than I couldn't give them in that classroom, in that self-contained classroom.
I studied with a guy who labeled that kind of process the let's make a deal model of inclusion, where the special ed teacher makes a deal with a regular teacher. You do this for me, I'll do this for you.
I've heard that actually, because when I did my PhD dissertation, I did talk to teachers that spoke about that experience. Let's make a deal.
Right.
I think I felt really grateful that the teachers I worked with were really open anyway. So I didn't really feel like I was making deals, but I have heard that.
When did you transition to the point where you thought, I believe in inclusive education and that's going to be my mission?
So it was at that school. I was there for 5 years. And after I went back, after I had my second child, I was only half-time in my self-contained class that I had been in for 5 years. It was a board that was really constantly shifting and changing. So there was a lot of movement. And then I was half-time in a kindergarten class. And that's when I really started to make those connections and really see, because up till then I had only ever taught in self-contained special education classes. So I didn't really know what was on the other side of.
So when you were doing that, I'm sure you'd heard about these people that wanted schools to be inclusive. What did you think of that?
Well, I think at that point, really, I think I really thought what we were doing was inclusive education. I don't think that I think I was really naive. And I remember, and then I went through another shift where I changed school boards again. And it was at that point where I had left having a full-time teaching contract to working part-time in supply work, because I wasn't able to at that point get back into the board, but we had moved and I couldn't drive anymore. I had 2 young kids. It was just a kind of a lifestyle change. And knowing that I would still be able to work and eventually something would come up, thought that I was going to apply for the PhD program, because that was something that I'd always knew that I wanted to do. I had thought maybe I would do it a little later in my career, but the timing seemed appropriate because I didn't have full-time work at the time to worry about. And it was at that point, actually, I had a conversation with the person who then became my dissertation supervisor. And I was talking to her about something I was doing in a class I was working in. I was full-time in a long-term position in a grade 5 class. And I had a child who was included in that class, who had an EA and had significant needs. And I thought we were doing some really awesome inclusion stuff. And I was talking to her about it, and she said to me, well, but is it really inclusion? And then I left, of course, that interaction. And the whole rest of the night, I was just thinking about that question, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I went to school the next day and I said to the EA that worked with me, we worked really, really well together. I was very lucky. And I said to her, it's not enough. We're not doing it right. We need to be better. And so we worked together to figure out how we could be better and how we could provide him and all the kids in the class. And that's what it really came down to. It really came down to, it wasn't just about this one student. It was really about everybody. And I needed to be able to wrap my head around what that meant and what that looked like.
So that was a bit of an aha moment.
For sure it was.
Yeah. Diane or Jackie?
I'm curious to know what you think about the assessment program that you didn't get into now, and what you've seen of the assessment process in terms of how kids are supported to be included.
So that's really interesting because I don't really, I have really mixed views on assessment and diagnosis and labels, personally and also professionally, because I feel that our job as teachers is to meet the needs of all the students we have in our class. And so I recognize that it does provide us with some information, but I don't know that teachers in schools are always equipped to use that information in the best way. Does that make
So,
sense?
I mean, that's a huge issue internationally, is that so many governments want to invest in assessment. All we need is a good assessment center. We're going to send everyone there. We're going to figure out, what we need to do, and then everything's resolved. But what's your sense when you talk about the teacher needs to be able to teach everyone in the class? Like, what's the link there? What do you have to know about the child? Say that, that boy who had the EA, what did you as a teacher have to know that might be different from what an assessment process would have provided?
Well, I think I needed to know about like what he likes and what he doesn't like. And I needed to know how he learns best. I think assessment can help me if I know what to do with that. I think an assessment that tells me that this child is, working in the 3rd percentile for language, that tells me a starting point maybe, but I need to see it as a starting point to help inform my practice, not as a spot where that child's going to stay or be. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it does. And sorry, Monique.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, sort of building on that, because if we think about the Ontario system, which is where we work, so much depends on getting that identification in order to get service. I mean, I know it's not what has to happen, but it's what a lot of people think has to happen. So how do we connect that? Like, how do we connect the assessment issues around the psychological assessment with what we do with teachers in our classrooms? I mean, thinking of yourself now as a teacher educator, how do you bring that to your practice when you're talking to the pre-service candidates?
Well, I think that's really important point that you bring up, Jackie, because that's where it has to start. Because the new teachers that are going out need to be equipped to know, and I'll tell them, you're all special education teachers. So, you're going to learn some things that are going to help you to be able to look at these issues and recognize. And I really focus a lot on what we do in our program, a lot on using universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. And when I get responses back from our 2nd year students that are just ready, going into their last placement, and they say things like, I get it. It makes sense now. I know that in order to have an inclusive classroom, I really need to use differentiated instruction, and I need to think that way and program that way and plan my lessons that way all the time. We talk about having an entry point for every student in a lesson, no matter where they're at. So what does that look like, right? And just putting them up to that challenge. And, I just got an email the other day from a student who had a really challenging 2nd placement. There was a group of kids in his class who had significant emotional behavioral needs. and he was really struggling to figure out how to meet their needs. And there was a lot of behavioral support from the board that was coming in to try and support him and his associate teacher. And when he did his evaluation, and I was observing his evaluation, and they had taken those kids out of the class. It wasn't his choice. It was that morning the teacher came and said, we're going to take them for a break while you do your, and we talked about it after, and I just challenged him. I said, well, I want you to try to see how you could incorporate a couple of the students into a lesson. And then he emailed me and he said, I did it and it was amazing. And then he emails me a couple weeks ago, just last week actually, about his third placement now. And now he says that he had a student in the class and he was using this teach a skill, something we did with them in our class, where they had to come to class prepared to teach a skill. So he was having his students do that. I think they were in grade 7 or 8. And he said he had one student that said, well, I'm not good at anything. So I don't know what to do. And he said, well, you have to be good at something. And he figured out that he spent a lot of time with his dad, who was a mechanic working on cars. So he arranged for the student to be able to show the class how to, I think he was going to change the windshield washer fluid or something in his car. So he thought outside the box and was able to provide that student who thought he wasn't good at anything an opportunity to, and that's that connection, right? It's like, how can you find that entry point for all of the students to be successful at something? That was an example.
And I think,
I just
Diana,
want you to know that I actually had goosebumps listening to your story, because it's just so frustrating when teachers haven't been helped to see that in their students.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Well, and I feel like they need to be pushed, but we need to give them the tools so that they can try things out. Like I always say to them, the teacher candidates, I always say, this is your teacher training. This is where you have the chance to try things out. Now, they're not always all supported in a way to be able to do that, but when they are, and absolutely with this student, when he messaged me the very first time about this placement, I thought he was very close-minded. It was a situation where he believed from his experience that inclusion was not working and wasn't good and it wasn't going to work. To now this student who's coming and saying, I can find a way to make learning happen and learning be successful for all the students in my class. I had goosebumps when I read it. I was almost like, I was emotional. Yeah. So.
And I think, it comes back to Diane, what you were talking about, and that, having an assessment, telling someone what their IQ level is, or what their strengths are, or none of that really matters, right? If our vision is, how do I include all children?
Yeah.
Because we know, kids learn to read the same way. Kids think the same way. Some might be faster, some might be slower, some might need a little bit more support, but we have this sort of mindset that I need to know how to teach a child with label X, Y, Z in order to be a good teacher. And that's just not the case. And it's, Monique, I wonder, how do we flip that, right? How do we do that? I mean, it sounds like you started in your program, but how do we spread that word that, what universal design for learning really is and how it can benefit all kids in the classroom?
I don't know. I don't think there's like a magic button. I think it's like the beach with the sand stars or the starfish. It's one starfish at a time, right? It's one teacher at a time. I don't know if I don't have nearly as much experience as you do, Jackie, but I know I have conversations with Sheila all the time about, she's like, I've been at this for a long time, and there's not a lot of shifting that has happened over time. And so I guess I have to, maybe I'm still hopeful that it can be one, because I see the things that they're doing. It's not every single one of them, and they don't all leave.
You worry that some of your idealistic students who pick up some level of motivation go out into schools, and within a few years it's lost to the culture of the school, which is not
Ab-
supportive of inclusion?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. And I always leave them and I always tell them, don't stop. I give them that like pep talk before they leave. Don't stop critically thinking about these topics that we've been talking about in this course. Don't stop being critical and looking at what's happening. When it seems like everything is going one way, don't be afraid to, go against the grain. But I do worry. I do worry that they do fall into, status quo.
When I was teaching teacher education students, I took a business card and I talked to them about one of the keys was to never consider or think or talk about their students as being defective. So I had this little card made out that was sort of a pledge. And the pledge was basically that I will never speak of defective students in my classes. And it had a little more on it than that. But I tried to register with them that when you go out there in the real world, don't listen to, don't talk about, don't think about your students as being defective. That was my answer. Not a very systemic one.
Can I switch gears for a second? Because we're talking about the teacher perspective, but I know that you've also done some work listening to students with intellectual disabilities. And most of the research that I've seen is focused on the social aspects. Do you have insights into how the students who are being included feel about being challenged academically and being included academically?
I don't. The students that I had interacted with in one of the studies that we did focused on students that had developmental disabilities, and some of the ones that I had met with weren't really that able to communicate that, like they could show me. And I did a lot of observation and I took some videos and photos and had some time to spend with them and to see how they were interacting with their peers. But not as far as being challenged academically. But I
do
do.
you see a relationship between the experience of the students and how committed their teachers are to including them and to applying universal design for learning or those kinds of approaches?
I think I do. I think that works for, like, I think that when we're using universal design for learning and differentiated instruction to create those entry points, I think I believe we're not benefiting just maybe the target student, but actually a lot of students are accessing that entry point and finding that success. Students that perhaps may not have done as well academically based on traditional ways of assessment, but provided with opportunities to kind of showcase their learning in a different way allows them to actually be really, really successful. And then you see the self-confidence go up. And I've seen that in my own experiences as a teacher. And as far as conversations I've had with colleagues or other teachers, and I know, again, it's teacher's perspective, not the direct student's perspective, but they've shared stories of students who they were not sure about how to program for them when they were entering their classroom. I'm thinking of one high school teacher who talked about a student coming into their music class, and they thought about this instrument that the student would be able to use, and it was a 3-note instrument. And they got the instrument and they thought, okay, well, if I can teach the student how to use this 3-note instrument, then they could, play like part of a song or a few chords or a few notes. And the student actually exceeded the teacher's expectation by being provided with that opportunity and went way farther, was able to do a complete song, and then they recorded it. And it was by far the shifting was greater in the teacher. I imagine the student, because they were put up to a standard to reach a level. I think that's what happens, right? When we have assumptions about where a student can reach or meet, because we have them, like we have this kind of baseline that, oh, they're working at a grade 3 level, so we're going to just work with them at grade 3 level. Then we don't provide them with the opportunity to be pushed farther, to see how far they could go, because we limit them based on the assessment, which goes back to what we were talking about before. So I think
we only have a few minutes left, and I want to know what your thoughts are about early childhood education and inclusion. And I know you've worked in that area. You sent your children to Montessori schools, and you've recently been involved in a project with Montessori school. Can you just reflect a little bit about how important it is that children in early childhood are included?
So thanks, Gordon. One of the things that I've come to understand over my learning, as part of my learning, is that inclusion needs to just be part of what we do, because it is part of life. And when you talk to really, really young kids about their friends, and there's all kinds of stuff all over the media, and there's studies about this, they don't see difference. And they see difference because we, or the adults in their lives, create that for them, because they learn from us, they learn from our modeling. And so if we have inclusion in the earliest years for children, and they see that everybody belongs here, and some people learn differently, and that's okay, because we can still do these things together. And they learn how to understand other people rather than see them as being removed from the class or just not there at all. Then, we're working on this. This is like a whole generational shift here that we're working on. And we have seen progress over time. I see my kids who are 11 and 13, 14, who have a completely different perspective on difference. And I say difference because I'm talking about like anything that they could possibly think is different from themselves. Then my nieces and nephews that are in their 20s, and that's only 10, that's 10 years difference, right? So, and I see that shift, and then even compared to say what my own experience would have been like. So I do see it moving. I see it's moving really slowly. And I see also the teacher candidates that are coming in, and the ones that are going out. It's going to take time, but again, I think it starts right down at the beginning, because that's the society. The society we want to create needs to start with the new people in society, because it has to be a lifelong process and journey. It can't be something that's so much harder to change ideas and perceptions. We do this with the adults that we work with, and we do our professional development with them, the teachers that we work with that are practicing teachers that have been teaching for several years, or just have had a life experience that's different than what we might hope for our students. Then there's a lot of work to be undone, all that unlearning that needs to happen.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up, but just tell me in a few words what we're going to be seeing as your work in the next couple of years, if we track what Monique Somma is up to.
I don't know.
What's it going to be?
Well, I think we're probably going to do some more work with some more school boards in the province. That'll be exciting. Possibly some more work with some Montessori schools across the province, maybe across Canada. I'm involved in a large project with some other academics across the country, looking at principals. So that's interesting, and looking at what makes an inclusive school culture. So we're going to be going in and hopefully going in and looking at what's happening in schools. So that's going to be interesting, because it's nice to see. We can hear lots of things, but it's nice to see what's happening.
That sounds like you've got lots on your plate for the coming years.
Yeah, and I'd like to go back and look at what you had mentioned before. So my master's research focused on students with emotional behavioral disorders, and I'd like to look at some ways that they can be provided with inclusive opportunities that are also therapeutic in nature. What does that look like? So,
Okay, Monique, thank you for being with us. I'll tell people they can go to our website, Inclusive Education Canada, and go to our associates pages, and you can find more information about Monique and her contact and some of the articles and things that she's written. So please do that. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us. It's been great to chat with you this afternoon, and take care.